Berkowitz is one of the fathers of environmental literacy, if there is such a thing. Maybe that embarrasses him since we haven't yet defined it. But Alan has been the head of education for the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies in Millbrook, New York for over 20 years. He's worked on urban ecosystems. He's developed curricula for K through 12 classrooms and been really front runner in thinking about how we can translate ecology to students of all ages. He was also the vice president of ESA and received the ESA Odom Award for Excellence in Ecology Education. So I'm going to turn this over to Alan to introduce his panel. There will be 3 questions, and each panelist will be addressing those questions, hopefully in a time-sensitive fashion, hint, hint, so that if they are within the time frame, we'll have about 5 minutes for the audience to ask them questions as we go along. And Alan will have that hard job of using the hook when he needs to. So everybody can share the mic, we hope. Thanks. Over to you, Alan.
Thanks. It's, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, but hopefully not needing it that much because our panelists are talking. Our panelists are going to introduce themselves in a minute, but I want to welcome them to the panel. This is my first time meeting several of them, and probably for many of you, the first time meeting them. And they're going to introduce themselves, plus their bios or their program. The plan for this hour is shown here. We're going to start with introductions, and then we have 3 questions. I will show the questions while they're addressing the questions so that you know what it is they're addressing, and also so that you can formulate questions for them about that topic. And this is kind of a little summary of what those 3 questions are. And then if we have time at the end, some thoughts about action ideas for the future. So I asked them in their introductions to give their background, what constituency they represent, and if they had one key take-home message for us today, what that would be. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the panel to begin their introductions. And here they are again on the list.
Hi, my name is Cassandra Carmichael, and I work for the National Council. There we go. Now I can hear myself. My name is Cassandra Carmichael. I direct the Eco-Justice Program and the Washington office for the National Council of Churches. Just to give you a brief idea of what that means is I represent 36 religious national organizations. They probably are ones that you see every day on the corner. The United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, some of the mainline Protestants, the Orthodox community, the black churches, so Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, for instance, and the historic peace churches. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of Protestant and Orthodox religious life. And for any of you that have ever been to various churches, you will know that they don't always agree on everything. And sometimes they don't agree on things like how you actually take communion, and they'll argue with you tooth and nail about that. But there's 3 things that they do agree on, and one of those is the need to protect God's creation. The other things that they come together on with great passion is the need to work for peace and the need to address poverty. So my job is to make sure that they work on that first piece, the need to protect God's creation. And so we have developed a program. It's an education for advocacy program. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point with a master's in environmental education. I took that degree, brought it with me to my current job, and stole all the great environmental education lessons that I learned there and built this model for them at the National Council of Churches. So it goes right through the main steps of environmental education: awareness, knowledge, values, developing people's skills to take action, and providing them opportunities to take action. And the one thing that you wanted me to do background and the take-home message. The one take-home message I think that the faith community I'd like you to sort of keep in mind and understand is that oftentimes when I would talk to secular teachers, doing environmental education, I would hear time and time again the struggle that they have for that third step, the value step. And that is something that the religious community does quite well because they have over decades, hundreds and thousands of years, developed the language, the metaphor, and the stories to talk about values. So the one takeaway and the one thing that keeps me really passionate about my particular position and the work that I do is the focus on the values and how that translates to people of faith and motivates them to take environmental action.
My name is Mark Stosnik. I'm Director of the Board of Science Education at the National Academy of Sciences, the National Research Council. First thing I should say is what that actually is. It's an independent, non-profit organization that advises officially the nation. So this has been chartered in 1863 under Lincoln, and it is an organization, lots of national academies in other countries as well. It's an honorific society of highly accomplished researchers and scientists of all sorts. And the main point that we're doing is when we advise the nation is to say, bring together people who have expertise to decide what is known, what is not known, and what we should know, and what is not the brain area. The brain is anywhere from thinking about nuclear waste to how we look at climate changes. And part of what we do is look at science education and science learning, broadly, creative, formal and informal. And as that, we have recently been embarking in something that's probably very relevant for the school, which is developing a conceptual framework for new national science education standards, which since we have gone public with the draft in July, has caused quite a stir in certain communities. Everybody feels my things not there. But the main point here is that we are trying to define what it means to be proficient in a much more complex way than it used to be. Actually, lots of great documents have been written before. And that goes to the take-home message, which is that proficiency in science, broadly speaking, is more than known facts. You all know that. But it has that point of disposition, practices, and so on and so forth. But also, and this is really relevant here, the notion that we understand what science is for, what it does, how it relates to society. And that's where we actually explicitly talk about global climate change for national science education standards. The second piece that we're working on is a climate change education roundtable here, and that gets down to the point of who's my constituency. My constituencies are decision makers in the federal government, larger societies and associations, people with money and influence, trying to educate them about what the evidence tells us one can do. And then climate change education roundtable, of which we have a workshop coming up next week, which you're happily invited to attend. We're going to have almost 200 people going to this. But the main idea is to inform people firsthand about best strategies, but also what kind of goals do we have? What is actually realistic for what kind of audience segment? Ranging anywhere from people who go to a botanical garden or a zoo or an aquarium or a science center, all the way to decision makers who have high decision-making power of what to do on the infrastructure of this country or policy systems. And I think the main point that I have to make is when we think about literacy, we have a realistic sense of what that means. Oftentimes literacy is defined as something where people individually are competent and know everything, so they can make decisions based on the evidence. But in fact, we know that's not realistic. So the question then becomes, at what point do we teach people about the background, who to trust, what are the sources that we need to go to, where is my own knowledge, where does my own knowledge end, and where does knowledge begin other people have that I can tap into.
Good morning. My name is Jermelina Tubas, and I am the Division Director for the Division of Community and Education within the Institute of Youth, Family, and Community under the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. That's quite a mouthful, so I'm just going to say IYFC and NIFA, which is within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And within the IYFC, we are responsible for a variety of programs that cover both formal and non-formal education. So we do believe in a very holistic approach in the education experience where classroom has to be reinforced outside of the classroom, whether it's through after-school activities and also bringing in the families. Excellent. Okay. So, but we do have our programs that focus on STEM education, particularly from K to 12, and we do have support for undergraduate, graduate education through fellowships and scholarships. And again, we're focusing on STEM, but these are all agriculture, food and science related programs. And we want to really have the idea that we are not just educating the next generation of leaders in agriculture, but also a well-informed citizenry who can actually focus on the different kinds of practices that are involved in agriculture that can also affect the environment.
My name is Terry Chapin. I'm an ecologist at the University of Alaska, and currently I'm president of the Ecological Society of America. And I thought maybe what I would do is just say something about a new initiative that the Ecological Society is promoting on Earth stewardship. And the general idea, I guess, behind this is that sustainability has a new meaning now, and this comes very close to the issues of environmental literacy. Sustainability is no longer static. The world is changing. It will never go back to the way it has been in the past. But what this means is that we have an opportunity like never before to shape the future of the world that we want. And so I feel that one of the important roles of ecologists, of teachers, and of students is to shape the world that we want to see in terms of environmental integrity and human well-being.
So I guess I can use this one. So the first question that I've asked the panelists to address is to kind of set the stage. Why is it vital for the constituency that you represent that there be broad environmental literacy among the general public by the year 2020? So one of the goals that Meg identified for the summit is to develop a decadal plan that by 2020 will result in a much more environmentally literate general public. So the first question that we've asked the panelists to consider is for you as an ecologist, as a member of the faith community, as an education standards person, and as a government resource management agency person. Why would it be really great for your constituency that there be broad environmental literacy by the year 2020? So who wants to begin? We have 15 minutes for this question. They will give some thoughts, and then we're hoping to have some audience questions about each of these three major questions.
So what I would probably add to the introduction is that our main partners are actually land grant institutions as well as non-land grant agriculture universities and colleges. So with that in mind, you can really see that we're really going into education for agriculture. Not really just at the undergraduate level, but because we require our institutions to partner with K to 12 institutions, that we are really bringing that message to as early as possible into the elementary grade levels. So what we actually are trying to do is that these institutions that we partner with do not just have research, but they actually have extension programs that extend to the communities, and part of that is to teach not only practices for good practices for agriculture, but also anything that has to do within their community that requires changes in the way they take care of their health, the environment, and all the other issues that could affect agriculture and change in the environment.
If I wanted to be cynical, I'd say it's a means to an end. At the end is an overall improvement in STEM education and STEM literacy, of which environmental literacy or sustainability literacy is now seen as an important component. A component that is both good in and of itself, as well as a hook. And the idea is that how can you make education meaningful to a whole lot of people for whom right now it is a drag. And the idea here is that the environment and the environment as a is a very good way of an entryway of teaching. That said, the idea of improving STEM education and the performance of your students in general, but it's also the idea of closing the gap that we have right now. It's the idea of making sure education is for everybody. Again, this is seen as a way that would be a mechanism to have that be possible. But aside from that, there are also other utilitarian reasons, you know, a better workforce, more college-ready students, and ultimately a better economy. And everybody hears about the green economy and how it's necessary to have the kind of workforce and the kind of skills that makes it possible to have this economy. And I think, for me, a little bit unfortunate, it's a very utilitarian perspective being taken rather than a more values-based perspective that we're going to next. But that's basically how I see it.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Don't Mess with Texas campaign that talked about trying to get folks in Texas to not throw their trash out the window. So the reason why environmental literacy would be really important is because in my realm, there's two things that I work on: stewardship and justice. Now, the stewardship issue is like the Don't Mess with Texas campaign. It can be somewhat more simplistic and not to discredit stewardship, but it can be sort of, let's tend to, let's care for, and it's the first step. But with environmental literacy and a sort of uncovering of all the complexity of environmental problems, not issues necessarily, but problems and issues, now we can start making the connections between environmental problems and communities of color and their disproportionate impacts, the connections between peace issues and environmental issues, the connections between poverty issues and environmental issues. And so now we can move from the realm of stewardship into the realm of justice. And I personally can't really do that by myself. So as we help to have the public have a better understanding and be more environmentally literate, then in my job, what will make it easier for me is then I can then take people along that spectrum to get into more complex issues, and from the religious community's perspective, into more of the deeper theology that's peppered throughout Scripture.
Over the past several decades, something on the order of 60% of the benefits that society receives from ecosystems have been degraded. And this is largely the result of individual actions by individuals like us. And so I think one of the really important challenges is for individuals throughout the world to take more of a sense of responsibility about their environment. And this is all about environmental literacy. So it seems to me that this initiative or this effort to enhance environmental literacy is really crucial to turning the world around. I think there's broad recognition now that that the planet's on a bad trajectory of the relationship between society and the environment, and that there's a narrow window of opportunity now to really turn this around. And this is going to take the action of individuals motivated by their concerns for local place, and I think this is what environmental literacy is all about.
Do we have questions from the audience for the panel about this? I think I have to recognize the name. Do we have microphones, or how you guys are so organized with microphones in the first part? Come on.
Hi.
Oh wait, there is a. Okay. Did you give your name and a quick, where you're from?
My name is Colibri. I'm director of Gaia. It's a nonprofit we started in Puerto Rico. It was actually founded by a 15-year-old student that right now isn't here representing Gaia, and I am, because she has won the Youth Power Award, and she's in San Francisco receiving that. And she wishes she could be here and we're both lists at the same time. She's a SEEDS alumni and an overachiever, and she founded this organization to promote environmental literacy basically in Puerto Rico, which if you've ever been there or know anything about Puerto Rico, we have a very, very big problem there. And the big problem is, and maybe this is where the question comes in, does environmental literacy include, or having environmental literacy means doing environmental ethical actions? So can somebody know the information, understand the information, but not act accordingly? Are they still environmental literate people? An example is I have a lot of professors who are PhDs, ecology PhDs, who know the information, understand the information. However, they do not bring their cup. They use styrofoam, or they use pumped up air conditioning even when it's a cool day, or basically they don't do basic things we can all do to minimize our impact, our individual impacts. So when you talk about environmental literacy, do you mean and include environmental action? So let's act accordingly to that understanding and that knowledge.
I'll start by saying people disagree on whether action is part of environmental literacy. There are many definitions of environmental literacy. I'm pretty sure that if we hold this place here in this room, we get very different opinions about that. That said, particularly what Terry said, and combining those two, I would say one of the problems that we're facing is that being literate, knowing about having dispositions, intentions to act, and actually acting on things, per se, we know it's not enough. So, if environmental literacy were to be defined as being knowledgeable, having ecological knowledge, environmental knowledge, to know all about these problems, we know that that in and of itself does not do the trick. And that's not because we want to blame people for this. That's because there's so many other factors that influence why people act the way they do. So the question becomes environmental literacy that includes action. Is it well-reasoned action? Is it habitual action? Is it habits and rituals that I'm engaged in? So there's very, very different and very complex ways of thinking about activities that people engage in. And that actually asks the question, what are the constraints and incentives that people are part of? Instead of saying, well, you should be a more moral person to do this, we realize, of course, that people live in societies. The easiest way to lower the carbon footprint of America is to have moved to Japan. And because as a society, it just CO2. So the question becomes, at what point does the idea of education end? And at what point do we want to educate people to start influencing the kind of incentives that prevent people on a large scale to do what they want to do?
I don't think we have the luxury anymore to wait for somebody else to solve the problem. I think each of us as an individual needs to be active. And one of the upsides of having such a monumental problem is that there's so many things that each of us can do, depending on who we are, what we're passionate about, and what our skills are. So I think the question is for each of us to ask, what are the things where we can make the biggest difference, and then to put our efforts into those things.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and just chime in a thought about that. I think that kind of recognizing the potential controversy about, or uncertainty about that part of the definition, I think we can all agree that action is required to become environmentally literate. In other words, people are not going to learn about the environment unless they do some things in it, they take an active role. And that, putting the action as kind of a requisite in order pathway to environmental literacy kind of changes the conversation in a way. And I think that it gets us away from necessarily judging your professors, for instance, for not doing the actions that you wish they did in your definition of environmentally sound behavior, and kind of opens it up to kind of a broader interpretation of actions as kind of contributing to their, so what are they doing that is contributing to their environmental literacy? And then also understanding their actions in the broader context of we don't want everybody to do exactly the same thing because we don't know all the things that people should do. So we need to celebrate the diversity of actions that people take and try to stay away from narrow definitions. Most of the studies that take a narrow definition of does education lead to behavior change we want, there's a lot of ambivalence about that data, and I think it's often because we use too narrow a definition of, we teach somebody to read, and then we see, do they read the kind of book I gave them? And maybe they don't, but maybe they read a totally different kind of book that won't show up on your test. So I think we need to be careful about where we put action and how narrowly we define kind of our test, or are they being environmentally literate in their actions. So Maggie, you want to?
Thanks, and I shouldn't take the mic, but I have a burning question that perhaps inspired some of this symposia, and it might be directed to Cassandra, but not exclusively. I'll put my hat on as a tropical biologist, and I work in a lot of developing countries where, like Ethiopia, where I showed a few pictures, Cameroon, the Amazon. The church down there absolutely takes stewardship so seriously. It's probably stronger than the government in many of those countries, and it is a welcome partner for conservation. So I've come to rely on it, but they also act and walk the talk. In Ethiopia, they are the centers of conservation of all biodiversity, and I come back to my church in Florida, and it's surrounded by a parking lot with the air conditioning on, and people having a great opportunity 7 days a week to use the site for a lot more than it's used. And so I just wondered if there is a way that the leaders of churches or the leaders of ESA or other organizations could really become more ruthless in creating programs that are exemplary instead of just lip service.
Yes. Actually, there are quite a few churches that are doing things, making their buildings more usable during the week and doing daycare and things like that. There are churches that are LEED certified, that are heading in that direction. There's all sorts of things that churches are doing, and synagogues as well, and mosques, that probably isn't getting a lot of attention. Not very well known. My observation from being both from the secular environmental field and then from the faith environmental field is that often those two entities, groups, don't mix and mingle. I sometimes get the impression that some of the secular environmentalists are very passionate about their work, but when I step into the room and they find out I'm a person of faith, there's a little bit of a sweat that goes down. I think they feel like I'm going to get out my conversion materials and spontaneously baptize them or something. So there is, I think, my observation is that there has been a hesitancy probably from the environmental scientists, from the environmental educators, from some of the secular environmentalists, particularly the secular environmentalists in my experience, to integrate and mix and mingle with those people of faith that also feel very passionate, that also might have different language. So one of the answers to your question, other than yes, is that there is a difference in approach, culture, and language. Even if you're the same person going to church or synagogue and the same person working for AWF, there's different cultural references and different language that happens within those two entities. And being able to understand that and being able to welcome it and be open, I think would be a great avenue to help the two worlds come together and merge, because there are, in my opinion, great opportunities that each offer the other. As I said in my opening, the secular environmental community could benefit from the faith community's ability to talk about moral ethics and values in a way that floors people like Senator Warner and others. But then the religious community can really benefit from having the knowledge and some of the expertise that the secular environmental community has.
Could I comment just briefly on that? I really agree with what you say, Cassandra, and I'm excited that the group of faith-based organizations and the Ecological Society are going to be meeting in about a month to talk about exactly these issues of how we can collaborate together. Because I think in many ways, environmental literacy involves a set of moral issues that are equally recognized by science and religious groups. And I think we have more in common than we have differences. And I think it's a question of how best to develop these commonalities and work together.
Very briefly, on education, STEM education is the idea that the value clarification and application, the idea of thinking about what's not thinking, is an important component in the future. Because it's not just faith-based groups that need to look at their values. Some of the problems that we're facing is
start to address the second question, which is, what would environmental literacy look like? What would it entail? Some of the themes that we heard from the panelists were kind of and it was reflected in the questions also, kind of what's the beyond the knowledge set of skills, dispositions? Is it a list of values, or is it an ability to identify your values and clarify them? We heard kind of two different versions of that discussion right here. So, but I think we heard each person touched on a vision of environmental literacy that went beyond a list of concepts or knowledge that people have to have. And so I'm kind of hoping that in your answer to this question, you'll go into a little bit more depth about what that might be. What would it look like? What would it allow people to do if they had it? So who wants to start with this set of questions?
Let me just start before I forgot what I was going to say. Basically, there are three things that I would like to focus on when we're talking about environmental literacy, and that has to start with education and educating students, teachers, and families. Those are the three important things that I think should have this access, because everything starts at home. Then when the students go to school, as soon as they learn about the environment, as soon as they learn about science, it's really the best way for them to get involved. So allowing them that knowledge that they are really part of the whole environment, that they need to know that and keep doing that after school, having after school programs and reinforcing that at home with the parents. So what does it mean? We have to educate not only the students, but we also have to help the teachers so they can actually get more interesting topics or part of their curriculum, get it started, and include that in their teaching, whether it's in the STEM areas or behavioral, which is very important actually to start at the very beginning, because behavioral is what drives these changes. We all need to learn good habits as we start with, from the time we get out of school and bring it back to our home. And once you get back to the house, it's very important that the parents will also have this ability to reinforce whatever the students have learned in school. It's something that we are administering along the line, because some of our parents are really very busy. They don't have time to give an update themselves on what's going on. But we can put it as part probably of the volunteer at school, at church, but we need the particular education for the parents so they can reinforce the students or whatever they learn in school.
I would summarize it with the word capacity. And particularly since you have the word cope with complexity and change, which means any static knowledge that we are providing people, or even static dispositions and attitudes, may not be working out for people in the long run. We have to be able to respond to change. And the way to respond to change, to complexity, to the confusing claims people make, the confusion that I have in myself about my values and the knowledge I have, is to create the capacity to deal with that kind of complexity and change. And I think that's where I come from a more foundational STEM education, value education idea. It's the idea of giving people, so to say, the fishing rod rather than the fish. And that is the important part in my perspective of what environmental literacy looks like. With the caveat that we need to understand that there are so many other claims of literacy out there. There are a gazillion organizations that have a claim or they want the public and anybody else to be literate in the thing that they care about. And how can these overlap? They overlap in the ability to create capacity, to think for themselves, to make value judgments, to educate themselves, to know the sources and so on and so forth. Now, I personally prefer that there's a stewardship component in it, but what is the right thing to do now to be a different thing tomorrow? So we have to be able to everybody has to be able to deal with change.
I would say two words, resonance and connection are the two main things that are needed. And I'll give you a quick example. We have a reverend who's working for the National Council of Churches in the Southeast, so North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, etc. And his job is to make sure that he's reaching out to African American churches to talk about climate change. Now, I will be honest and say that that is not a topic that has been at the top of that church list. So, but what he's been able to do is have lessons with them. He's been able to go to those pastors in those churches and talk to them in a way that relates to where they are, so that they begin to see that global climate change actually is about them. And he's had phenomenal success. The other thing he does is he has a connection piece. How does global climate change connect to, for instance, in his case, poverty issues? So he talks about how African Americans just pay more for energy use than other communities, like white communities. So he makes that connection to energy, he makes that connection to poverty. So resonance and connection, I think, would be two key elements to include in any sort of environmental literacy.
I would agree with Cassandra. It strikes me that one of the most important things about environmental literacy is strengthening connection to place, not only in having the tools and the understanding and the interest in knowing how place affects you as an individual, but also how your actions influence the place that you care about, both locally, and then how those aggregate effects influence the world more broadly. So I think understanding these connections to place is really important as a two-way dialogue. Also, I think it's really important to empower people to improve the places that they care about. So this gets into the issues of environmental justice. And so this requires an understanding of a lot of sciences, both natural and social science, in order to be able to accomplish those things.
You guys have any questions for each other? We're going to open up to questions from the audience. That's Tom. Introduce yourself, please.
My name is Tom Arsipi. I direct the Learnign Field Station in Texas. Let me give you a little bit of context before I ask the question. You know, my field station's in the middle of the Texas Hill Country. The county I'm in has a total population of about 4,000 people. It's a sparsely populated area. Texas is over 97% private property, yet 85% urban. So there's a real big disconnect there. So when we're talking about environmental literacy, the definition is important and what it entails. I had a conversation a few weeks ago with a rancher, and I used the term environmental literacy. His reply to me was, well, I care about what those ignorant tree huggers are doing. The term environmental is a really negative term in a lot of places west of the Mississippi. So what I have learned is what is acceptable terms are natural resources, stewardship. Ranchers and landowners view themselves as good stewards of the land. I could talk about all of Leopold. So natural resource stewardship. So flexibility is an important component of the definition of environmental literacy. And I like the discussion about place and what your stakeholders and constituencies are have a lot to do with relating about what environmental literacy is.
Hi, I'm Matthew Inman. I'm a physics teacher in general science out of Washington State, and currently here as a fellow with the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the Department of Energy. I have been tasked with an energy literacy project, and you may be aware there was a climate literacy project that 13 agencies signed on to. They have this little brochure, but lots of other stuff behind it. And so my question is, and the panel kind of alluded to this earlier, this issue of how these different literacies fit together. So we say environmental literacy, we're not defining it really clearly here, and Then we have climate literacy, energy literacy, I would argue all connected under this idea of sustainability, but needing to somehow fit together. And as one of the initial speakers today suggested, we need to not be duplicating our efforts, and we need to be kind of streamlining where we're heading. So wanting the panel to get kind of specific with regard to environmental literacy and how all these pieces fit together.
I think one of the biggest challenges is coming to grips with trade-offs. We can I think it's important to consider all of these things together, but I think it's important to consider all of these things together, but at the same time,
Take the logical limits.
I think it's important to consider carefully the trade-offs and the value systems associated with making those trade-offs, and therefore the decisions that individuals and groups make. So being conscious of the implications of decisions that a particular set of actions has.
I would add that conservation literacy, ecological literacy, and so that's what I was referring to before. There's so many literacies out there, it gets busy. And I think you were making a very good point, which is you don't stay on ground. And what ties them all together, and the rest you go about it, but having groups talk about that. And the one thing I want to really mention, that you just waved the climate literacy brochure. When you look at this, it's a long list of things that people ought to be able to do and know. And it's very detailed. And we extend that to all sorts of other areas. We really quickly realize that we are asking people a lot. And so that really asks the question of these meta skills that people ought to have, in my mind. So that it transcends the individual lists of literacies that we are thinking about, so that they become the guidelines, but not necessarily for the idea of public understanding of it. So the idea of coordinating and doing one level up would be useful.
I want to just also chime in a kind of an optimistic view of this. I actually think it's great. In other words, I think it's dizzying and confusing and daunting, and I think it does call for some meta umbrella integration effort. But at the same time, I think what these literacy efforts represent is kind of a new commitment to having education that's useful. I think that's kind of cool. That's why I think that's what's behind using the word literacy as opposed to a more neutral understanding, like we want to have a climate understanding initiative or an environmental understanding initiative. I think we like the word literacy because it implies that it's more than knowledge, so that it's skills and dispositions to use those skills, and that there's a utility involved. And that gets all the way back to the first literacy that I learned about, which is the literacy of reading. And in order to be literate at reading, it's not just knowledge of the vocabulary, it's a set of skills and dispositions that allow you to read for a purpose, to be a citizen, to enjoy the great art. And I think that's why we use the word literacy, and I think it's a really great thing that all these different areas where human impact is now emerging on scales that are unprecedented. We realize we need more than understanding of climate, we need literacy about climate. So I think that's a really good thing. And the partnerships that are being brought together in order to do that are great, and it sort of cause us to chafe with an education system that in the formal realm tends to compartmentalize and then to particularize outcomes into things, understandings usually that are easy to measure on standardized tests. So that's kind of where any one literacy effort, let alone the multiplicity of literacy efforts, are going to have a challenge in getting into the formal school system from my perspective. We have time for one more question, so in the back.
Okay, my name is Richard Mabey, and I'm from Kansas City, and I'm a community organizer. And I guess this question, my question kind of goes with this particular one you're asking, or any of them that you're asking. And it's kind of on the tail of the young lady that spoke about the person going into the African American churches and having success. Okay, from my calculation from the work that I do in low-income communities, less than 1/3 of our population attend churches now. So my concern is, in all of you, from the academic standpoint, from the education standpoint, or any of the work that you're doing, do you have anything that you take in consideration of that portion of society that's not in what would be considered mainstream, of how we're going to be able to also get them up to speed as far as the environment is concerned?
One possibility is through children. And I think this hits at the heart of educational issues and environmental literacy. If we can persuade kids that relating to their place, relating to their environment is important, they'll go home and talk about it with their parents. Since all the kids go to school, that's a wonderful avenue to the rest of society.
I think it's a great question, and it's one of the things that I think that the faith community can do. I realize that not everybody in low-income communities or in other non-mainstream communities attend church, but some of them do. And when I talked about the gentleman that was working in North Carolina, the black churches in the Southeast are very strong, and particularly low-income communities. So that's one of the things that we try to do is to reach beyond what I would call the low-hanging fruit, people that are in the choir, people that are already with us, so to speak, on environmental issues, and get to those folks that aren't, quote, with us or with the environmental activities and environmental movement. And I think one of the ways to do that is, as we've sort of heard throughout this, is to use different languages. The gentleman from Texas talked about being flexible, resonance, and things like that.
Yep, time's up for that. So we're now going to move on to our third. We're going to move on to our third question. So what are people? So you folks represent, and you're not necessarily delegated here by all ecologists or all people of faith, or et cetera. But what are a couple of things that your constituency is able, prepared, or maybe not prepared, but could conceivably do to contribute to the effort to create the kind of environmental literacy that we're talking about?
As I said earlier, most of our partners are with academic institutions. We do have other non-for-profit institutions and other non-academic institutions, but basically because of their ability to reach different levels of students in the academic ladder, we believe that they're already doing a lot of these things, teaching them how to be more sensitive not only to the environment first, but also sensitive to the needs of people around them. And this is in response to the gentleman over there, getting the underrepresented groups into the mainstream. We do have programs, and a lot of these institutions do take into consideration. They don't want me to say that. they do take into consideration that we have a lot of issues to take care of, and these institutions cover everything.
It is my sense that at least in science, the STEM education, it's a great, there's a great sense of creating educational experiences that are meaningful and that are connected to societal goals. And environmental literacy, broadly speaking, despite the fact that I said there's so many of them, the idea behind that is really inserting itself. And I think there's a willingness both on the side of educators to create standards that infuse this kind of thinking into schools. But there's also a huge, vast network and tapestry of informal institutions that are now really serious. That are seriously working on environmental literacy goals throughout, from science centers and science museums to aquariums and zoos and so on and so forth. There's a strong movement going on. I just came from a conference of the Association for Science and Technology Centers, and sustainability, climate change and so on and so forth are topics that people are really struggling with. So that's the good news here. And the other good news is that many of the funding agencies, some of which are here represented, from the National Science Foundation to NOAA to NASA, having major funding streams whereby we can do research but also development of educational experiences that address the issue of environmental literacy in broad ways, from climate literacy to stewardship and so on and so forth. And I think there's a great willingness to do this, and that is a great hope that I have. And so this is actually quite an exciting time to be an environmental educator.
Two things that the faith community, first of all, 100,000 churches are the churches that are represented for the National Council of Churches, 45 million people, so I'm not speaking for them all. But two of the things that they have been doing and are doing more of is voice in their hands. So they bring voice from the pulpit, they bring voice from the pews. Internally, they're changing their buildings, their, the metaphor of the hands. The other thing they're doing with their voice, they're doing the green building. The other thing they're doing with their voice is making sure that they talk to their elected officials. And there is nothing more intimidating to an elected official as when someone walks in with a white collar around their neck, or a nun walks in and there's a little bit more reverence that is given. And we've had great success. The one issue that the faith community in general, across the board, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, etc., have been focusing on quite exclusively is climate change. And we've been doing both those things of action in the congregation and bringing the voice from the pews out to the world.
I think there's three things that ecologists could do more effectively in this arena. One is to work closely with people from other disciplines, with the social sciences, with religious groups, with practitioners, to be able to listen to the other perspectives on these issues so that we have a broader way of thinking about environmental literacy. Secondly, I think we need to be more effective in reaching out to the media, reaching out to policymakers to convey the issues of environmental literacy. And I think this oftentimes involves understanding how to get the right vocabulary to the right audience and the right message to the right audience. And finally, I think another very practical thing is just working carefully with pre-service teachers. Something on the order of half of the teachers that will be teaching a decade from now are people who are not yet in the school system. They're people that are going to be going through college. And so if we can do a better job of educating those potential teachers, I think there's a tremendous multiplier effect by which we could influence environmental literacy.
We have a mic. I don't want to give up my mic because it's working.
Okay, hold on tight. Gerald Alexander, American Federation of Teachers. My members work in poor urban areas and in poor rural areas. And I don't mean to bring in the R word, but we've got high degrees of unemployment, especially in communities of people of color. I want to see how your constituencies might be willing to at least think a little bit outside the box. Our kids are infinitely distracted nowadays. And one of the big distractors is Army recruiters, Marine recruiters, Navy recruiters. And I mean, they have lots of money. They make friends with kids. They entice them with, games. Yet the Department of Defense says this is a national security issue. And given the fact that the next Congress is probably not going to be amenable to funding streams that exist now, and their deficit hogs, how can we engage the Department of Defense, the Army, the Navy, to really help provide environmental literacy? I mean, it's really hard probably for the churches. I mean, peace is a big issue, and they're trying to prepare people to go to war. But they have the hearts and minds of very young people, especially in communities of color. I'm wondering how your constituencies have, in the past, worked with those folks over there in the Pentagon, or do you have any ideas on how we can?
They're looking at me. Part of the government. And extension services to rural areas, and we also have a rural development programs, and so that's one of the ways that we get to that. And definitely the military family, the Department of Defense recognize these issues with families moving, and so they want to make sure that wherever they are given the same kind of leadership training that they might get if they're not moving from place to place.
So the higher powers have shown me the hook, but we have time for one more question. So you have it back.
Yes, thank you. My name is Rich Innes. I work with a very good group called Nature Bridge. And just briefly, we're the largest partner of the National Park Service. We get about 40,000 kids a year going through campuses in Yosemite, in Olympic National Park, for a science-based 3 to 5 day educational experience there. But to get to your question though, to just, as I think that my neighbor here pointed out, environmental literacy is not the goal and we all acknowledge that it's a step to the goal of how do we actually see changes in the environment. And one way to do that, especially with kids, but even with adults, is to give them an application for what they're learning. So if they're learning science, that's all great, but if they can then go out and say, okay, well we can actually test water quality, that there is an application here that has real implications for my community, and just across the board. So that's just a thought. I'd love to get a little bit of reaction to that, is how you give real world applications to what we're learning about the environment, so that people are thinking, okay, how can I translate this into a career, into real actions that are going to address some of these monumental problems that we're confronting.
Well, I have the luxury in my community is that we don't have to test people to find out how they did on a particular Sunday school activity. But our entire program is built, as I said earlier, an education for advocacy model. That advocacy is in their personal lives, in their congregational and community lives, and in their civic engagement lives. So our focus is not on just learning about a bug or an elephant or a tree, but how that relates and connects to their values and what folks can do, either adults or children, to take action on that. So our entire focus is that, but again, we have the luxury is I don't have bubble sheets that I have to grade later.
It seems to me that learning will be a lot more effective if it's tied to some sort of activity and action. So it seems like a really logical thing to just tie learning about the environment into acting in terms of the environment. And I think that's true for each of us as individuals, no matter where we are in the educational system.
And the good news is what we're attempting to do with the framework for new science education standards is precisely that, learning through action. And that we would like to push that children are not assessed by the factoids that are, but by the performance that they can show, by the kinds of things the kind of problems they can solve. And hopefully that will change at least the school system a little bit. Nothing's ever as perfect as one would like it to be, but that would help. And I would say that I've seen in the many years that I've worked in informal education that there is a gazillion of excellent programs that do exactly that. It's actually amazing how much work is being done already.
Just to say that within the federal government, there are a lot of programs that focus on learning through action. And there are a lot of programs that are done inside the classroom and also outside of the classroom, as well as it extends to communities. So it's not, we do keep thinking about ways. And we keep asking our grantees to develop other methods and approaches so that we can have a more probably effective way of reaching more and engaging more of the students.
So I want to thank our panel and ask the audience to join me in thanking them for